He left a suicide letter. The door was locked from the inside. Everyone said it was his choice. But what if the only thing he didn't choose was the timing? Daniel Mercer had always hated midnight. Not for the superstition. Not because he believed the day changed its nature when the clock did. He hated it because midnight was when people started lying to themselves about what could still be fixed. At midnight, editors began saying things like we can still adjust the wording. Lawyers began saying things like we can still protect you. Politicians began saying nothing at all, which was its own language. At midnight, you either published, or you began negotiating with your own courage. Daniel sat at his kitchen table with the laptop open, the last draft of his investigation staring back at him like a calm enemy. The file name was plain. Too plain, considering what it contained. Mercer_final_7.docx. He should have renamed it something theatrical. Something that matched the story it would become in other people's mouths. But Daniel didn't like drama. Drama distracted from facts, and facts were the only things he trusted to stay the same when everyone else changed. He scrolled. A paragraph here. A sentence there. A comma that didn't deserve to survive the night. He wasn't rewriting, he was performing a ritual that made him feel less helpless. He had spent months building the piece. 6 months of phone calls, encrypted messages, people who met him in cafes and stared at the door as if the door itself might be listening. 6 months of documents that arrived in dull envelopes, handoffs that felt absurdly old-fashioned for a modern scandal. 6 months of waking up with the sense that his life was being rearranged by forces he could not see, and falling asleep anyway. Now, the article was finished. Which should have been a relief. But Daniel had learned the dangerous truth about endings: they didn't reduce tension. They concentrated it. His phone buzzed on the table. A message. Mara, editor-in-chief, still awake. Daniel typed back without looking at the keyboard. Daniel, still here. The cursor blinked in the document, patient, as if it knew he'd come back. Another buzz. Mara, legal wants one more pass. They're comfortable, but not comfortable. Daniel read the text twice. The phrasing mattered. Comfortable, but not comfortable was what people said when they were trying to keep their fear sounding professional. Daniel didn't reply immediately. He stared at the window above his sink. Outside, the city looked like a place that had already decided to forget whatever he was about to reveal. Streetlights cast pale cones on wet pavement. A bus moved in the distance, its interior lit like an aquarium. Somewhere, someone laughed, a brief careless sound. Daniel turned back to his laptop and scrolled to the section Mara was worried about. There were names in it. Not as many as people would assume. Daniel had never believed in naming everyone. He believed in naming the ones who mattered and proving why they mattered. The names were attached to actions, and the actions were attached to documents, and the documents were attached to signatures that people had assumed no one would ever compare. The scheme was simple in concept: public money moved through private entities and returned to public hands as influence. Simple enough to explain to a reader. Complex enough to prosecute, because complexity was its own defense. Daniel's cursor hovered over one sentence. He read it aloud, quietly, as if hearing it might reveal a weakness. This contract was awarded not for competence but for loyalty. It was accurate. It was measurable. It was also, Daniel knew, the kind of sentence that made powerful people feel naked. He glanced at the time again. 12:17 a.m. He hadn't eaten dinner. He hadn't noticed. He closed the document and opened his email drafts. A message to Mara, unsent. Subject line, ready. Body, it's clean. Publish at 9 a.m. as planned. I'll be awake. He stared at the draft for a long moment. Then he didn't send it. Not because he hesitated. Because he had learned that once you pressed send on something like this, you stopped belonging to your private life. You became a public event. Daniel didn't fear death as much as he feared turning into a headline that other people would use to rehearse their morality. He stood, walked to the fridge, opened it, stared at the contents, and closed it again. He went back to the table and Saturday. The chair creaked in the same place it always did. Daniel's apartment was small, 2 rooms and a kitchen that tried hard to pretend it wasn't part of the living space. It was the kind of place you chose when you didn't want your belongings to begin telling stories about you. He didn't have much. Books, mostly. Papers. A few plants he kept alive out of spite. On the wall near the table was a framed front page from years ago, his first major investigation, a scandal that had seemed monumental at the time and now looked almost innocent. A reminder. Not of success. Of how quickly the world learned to absorb outrage and keep eating. The phone buzzed again. This time, it wasn't a message. It was a call. Unknown number. Daniel stared at it until the ringing stopped. A second later, it rang again. Unknown number. Daniel's instinct was to ignore it again. But instinct wasn't always wisdom. Sometimes instinct was just the part of you that wanted to pretend you were safe. He answered. Daniel Mercer, he said. A pause. Then a voice, male, middle-aged, calm. Mr. Mercer, the voice said. I apologize for the hour. Daniel kept his tone neutral. You called twice, he replied. So I assume it's important. Yes, the man said. It is. Daniel waited. The man spoke slowly, with the measured cadence of someone who had spent years learning how to sound reasonable while delivering uncomfortable truths. My name is Adrian Voss, the voice said. I work in crisis management. Daniel almost smiled. Crisis management. A polite title for someone paid to rearrange consequences. I didn't ask, Daniel said. Voss paused. No, he agreed. You didn't. Daniel listened to the silence on the line. He could hear a faint hum behind the man's voice, an office late at night, or perhaps a car idling. What do you want? Daniel asked. Voss didn't threaten him. He didn't try to charm him. He did something far more effective. He spoke as if Daniel had already agreed to a conversation. I want to prevent you from making an error, Voss said. Daniel's fingers tightened around the phone. An error, Daniel repeated. Yes, Voss replied. A timing error. Daniel felt a slight chill. Explain, Daniel said. Voss exhaled quietly, as if preparing to deliver a brief to someone important. You have a piece scheduled for release tomorrow morning, Voss said. Daniel didn't respond. Voss continued. It will cause unnecessary collateral damage, he said. Not to the people you imagine. Daniel's voice stayed even. Collateral damage is what happens when people steal public money, he replied. Voss's tone didn't change. I'm not calling to debate ethics, he said. I'm calling to give you information that you don't currently have. Daniel's mind sharpened. Which is, he asked. A small pause. Then Voss said, your source is about to be exposed. Daniel's throat tightened. He forced his voice to remain calm. Which source? He asked. Voss didn't answer directly. Instead, he said, the one you believe will be protected by anonymity. Daniel's mouth went dry. That could have been several people. But the way Voss said it, singular, narrowed the field. Daniel's mind went to the person who had been the most careful, the most afraid, the one whose hands had trembled slightly when sliding an envelope across a table. Daniel swallowed. You're lying, he said. Voss's voice remained smooth. I'm not, he said. And you can verify it. Daniel's heart rate increased. He felt it in the tightness of his chest. How? He asked. Voss said something that made Daniel's stomach turn. Check your inbox, Voss said. Look for a message timestamped 6 minutes ago. From an address you've never seen. It will contain a photograph. Daniel's eyes flicked to the laptop. He didn't open it yet. Why would I trust you? Daniel asked. Voss's tone held no impatience. Because you're a journalist, he said. And because I'm giving you something verifiable. Daniel opened his laptop and switched to his email. A new message. No subject line. From an address that looked like a random string. He clicked it. A single attachment. He opened it. The photo loaded slowly. And then Daniel felt the world tilt slightly. It was a photograph of a woman stepping out of a building. Not a public figure. Not someone famous. Someone Daniel recognized instantly. His source. Captured from a distance, candid, unaware. A date stamp in the corner. A time. A location. And in the background, barely visible, a man Daniel recognized too, a minor government aide he had mentioned in the draft. Daniel stared at the screen. His fingers went cold. He heard Voss's voice through the phone. You see, Voss said gently, why timing matters. Daniel's jaw clenched. You're threatening her, he said. No, Voss replied. I'm informing you that others will. Daniel stared at the photo again. It was too clean to be a guess. It was surveillance. It meant someone had been watching. It meant someone had known where to look. You did this, Daniel said. Voss's tone remained calm. I didn't, he said. But I know who did. Daniel's mind raced. What do you want? He asked again, sharper now. Voss's answer was infuriatingly reasonable. I want you to delay publication, he said. 24 hours. That's all. Daniel laughed once, bitter. So you can bury it, he said. No, Voss replied. So you can protect her. Daniel stared at the photo. He thought of the woman's hand shaking as she handed him documents. He thought of her whispering, please don't use my name. He thought of what it meant that someone had photographed her now. Daniel's breathing slowed, controlled. Why tell me? He asked. Voss paused. Because you're not the enemy, he said. You're a variable. Daniel felt anger flare. A variable, he repeated. You have principles, Voss said. And principles are predictable. You want justice, truth, impact. Those are admirable. Daniel said nothing. But predictable people can be guided, Voss continued. And I would prefer you guided toward harm reduction instead of escalation. Daniel's hand tightened around the phone again. This is manipulation, Daniel said. Voss didn't deny it. Yes, he said. But I'm offering you a choice. Daniel's eye stayed on the photo. A choice. He hated that word when it came from people like Voss. Because it usually meant, choose between two forms of loss. What happens if I publish anyway? Daniel asked. Voss didn't threaten. He didn't need to. He simply said, then she will not be safe. Daniel felt a cold heaviness settle in his chest. And if I delay? He asked. Voss's tone softened slightly. Then you buy time, he said. You relocate her. You adjust. You protect what you claim to value. Daniel's mouth tightened. And you get 24 hours to prepare your defense, Daniel said. Voss exhaled. Everyone prepares, he said. That's what systems do. Daniel closed the photo without meaning to. The blank email stared back at him like a bruise. He spoke quietly. You're telling me to choose between truth and a person, he said. Voss's voice was calm, almost sympathetic. I'm telling you that you always have, he replied. Daniel felt something in him crack slightly, not a breakdown, not yet, but a shift. He'd spent his career pretending those choices weren't real. Pretending there was always a third option, publish and protect. Reveal and shield. But the world didn't respect third options. It forced binaries and called them moral tests. Daniel's voice turned cold. Who are you really? He asked. Voss paused. A man who cleans up after decisions, he said. Daniel's eyes narrowed. Whose decisions? He asked. Voss's answer was quiet. Not yours, he said. Daniel stared at his kitchen table. At the mug with dried coffee rings. At the laptop. At his own hands, suddenly looking unfamiliar. He realized he was shaking. Very slightly. He hated that more than anything. He forced his voice steady again. I'll think, Daniel said. Voss didn't sound relieved. He sounded as if he expected it. Thank you, Voss said. One more thing. Daniel's jaw tightened. What? He asked. Voss's voice dropped, almost confidential. Do not tell your editor about this call, he said. Not yet. Daniel froze. Why? He asked. Voss replied evenly, because the leak isn't only political. Daniel's throat tightened. You're implying, Daniel began. Voss interrupted softly. I'm implying nothing, he said. I'm advising. If you want to protect your source, reduce the number of people who know. Daniel felt nauseated. He hated how reasonable it sounded. He hated how quickly it made him suspicious of everyone around him. He hated how effective it was. The call ended. Not abruptly. Politely. Voss said good night. Daniel didn't respond. He lowered the phone and stared at the black screen as if it might show him something honest. He sat at the table and did nothing for a long moment. The city outside continued. A car passed. Somewhere, a dog barked. Daniel opened the draft email to Mara again. Subject, ready. He hovered over send. Then he didn't. He opened a new email instead. To no one. A blank draft. He typed a single sentence, then deleted it. Typed it again. Deleted it again. The sentence was simple. We need to delay. He couldn't write it. Not because it wasn't true. Because writing it made it real. Daniel stood and walked to the bathroom, splashed cold water on his face, looked at himself in the mirror. His eyes looked older than they should have. He whispered, to himself, like a man testing language. 24 hours. He returned to the table. He opened his document again and scrolled. The names looked different now. Not dangerous. Exposed. Daniel imagined his source's face. He imagined her being questioned, cornered, punished. He imagined her calling him and him not answering because he was busy defending his principles. Daniel closed the document. He opened his notes file, the one with contact details for sources. He stared at the phone number. He didn't call. He didn't text. Because calling meant action. Action meant acknowledging that Voss's warning mattered. And if Voss's warning mattered, then Daniel's control did not. He sat in the quiet for a long time. Then he began to do what he always did when he couldn't control events. He began to write. Not the article. Something else. A letter. He didn't title it Suicide Note. He didn't date it dramatically. He opened a blank document and typed. If you're reading this, it means I couldn't finish what I started. He stopped. His fingers hovered above the keys. That sentence felt too final. Too shaped. He deleted it. He started again. I'm sorry. He stared at the two words until they felt like a lie. He deleted them too. Daniel Mercer was not a theatrical man. He didn't write apologies. He wrote explanations. So he began the only way he knew how, with facts. I have spent years believing that truth is enough. He paused. Then added. It isn't. The cursor blinked. Daniel inhaled. He could feel the pressure of time now, not the deadline, but something deeper. The weight of being trapped between options that were all wrong. He kept typing. There are moments when waiting becomes a kind of surrender. And surrender becomes a habit. He stopped again. His throat tightened. He realized, dimly, that he was writing because it gave shape to panic. Panic was too formless. A letter became structure. Structure felt like relief. He continued. I can't keep waiting for permission to finish what I started. He reread the sentence twice. It sounded like him. It was true. He didn't delete it. He wrote more. Not a confession. Not an accusation. A portrait of a mind exhausted by postponement. He wrote about the way editors delayed not because they didn't believe him, but because they feared consequences. He wrote about the way lawyers tried to protect people by sanding down truth until it became unrecognizable. He wrote about the way politicians never said no outright, they simply made yes too costly. Daniel wrote until 2:48 a.m. Then he stopped and stared at the screen. The letter was too long for a suicide note. Too coherent. Too calm. It was the kind of letter a man wrote when he wanted his exhaustion to be understood, not when he wanted to die. Daniel saved it. He printed it. The printer whirred loudly in the quiet apartment, a sound that made him flinch. He held the pages in his hands. The paper felt warm from the machine. He read the first paragraph again, standing. It sounded like him. Which comforted him and terrified him at the same time. Because it meant that if this letter was ever found, no one would doubt its authenticity. Daniel placed it on the table, under a mug so it wouldn't move. He looked at the time. 3:05 a.m. He should have slept. But sleep required believing there would be a morning worth waking into. He opened his laptop again. He opened Mara's chat thread. He typed. We need to delay. Then he deleted it. He typed. Something's wrong. Deleted it. He typed. Call me. He stared at it. Then deleted it too. Because calling Mara meant bringing her into the decision. And bringing her in meant spreading risk. Voss had warned him. Reduce the number of people who know. Daniel hated that advice. But he understood it. The cruel logic of it. He stood, walked to the bedroom, and sat on the edge of the bed. He stared at the wall. His thoughts looped. If he published, his source might be exposed. If he delayed, the story might die. If the story died, everything he'd done meant nothing. If everything meant nothing, then what was he? Daniel pressed his palms against his eyes. He felt a wave of exhaustion, heavy and sudden. He lay down fully clothed. He closed his eyes. He did not sleep. Not properly. He drifted. In and out of shallow darkness. At 4:10 a.m., he got up and went to the kitchen again. At 4:12, he drank water and didn't taste it. At 4:15, he stood by the window and watched the city. At 4:20, he sat at the table again, hands on either side of the printed letter. The letter looked accusatory now, even though it wasn't. He imagined someone reading it in a police uniform. Someone nodding. Someone saying, yes. That makes sense. Daniel had seen enough suicide notes in his work to know what made authorities comfortable. Coherence. When a suicide note sounded logical, people believed it. They didn't like messy deaths. They liked narratives that tied violence into personal tragedy. Daniel's phone buzzed again. A message this time. Unknown number. No greeting. No name. Just text. 24 hours saves her. One more night. Daniel stared at it. His throat tightened. He didn't respond. He placed the phone down and folded his hands. He had not been threatened. Which was its own kind of threat. Because if he'd been threatened, he could have been righteous. He could have been angry. Anger was energizing. This was something else. This was being forced into moral arithmetic. He thought of his source again. He thought of her children. Yes, she had mentioned children once, offhand, like a detail she regretted sharing. He thought of what it meant to save her. Daniel whispered to himself, barely audible. 24 hours. He stood. He walked toward the bathroom. Then he stopped in the hallway, as if his body had forgotten what it intended to do. He turned and looked back at the kitchen table. The letter. The laptop. The printed words that sounded like a man preparing to end something. Daniel felt a strange clarity for a moment. Not peace. Not acceptance. A clinical realization. If he delayed, he would lose the story. If he lost the story, he would lose himself. If he lost himself, he would still be alive, but hollow. Daniel had spent his life believing his work was the only proof that he mattered. That belief had sustained him. Now it threatened to kill him. He walked into the bedroom and opened the wardrobe. He took out a suit jacket, then put it back. He looked for something and didn't know what. The apartment felt too small. His thoughts were too loud. At 5:02 a.m., his phone buzzed again. This time it was Mara. Mara, legal wants to push to tomorrow. Just in case. I hate it. Tell me what you think. Daniel stared at the message. His hands went numb. Just in case. The words made his stomach drop. Because they meant Mara was already leaning toward delay. Which meant the story was already slipping. Daniel typed back. His fingers shook as he wrote. Daniel, do what you need to do. I trust you. He sent it before he could delete it. The message flew into the world and became irreversible. Daniel stared at the sent confirmation. His chest tightened. He had just agreed to postponement. He had just surrendered to the thing he feared most. And he had done it politely. He looked at the printed letter again. Now it felt prophetic. Daniel sat down. He put his head in his hands. He stayed like that, unmoving, until the light outside shifted slightly. Morning approached. Not as comfort. As a deadline for endurance. At 7:11 a.m., Mara arrived at the newsroom. She was carrying coffee and pretending it was an ordinary morning. She wasn't fooled. Neither was anyone else. The editorial floor was quiet, which meant anxiety was high. Quiet in a newsroom was never natural. It was management. Mara set down her bag, opened her laptop, and checked the content management system. The slot for Daniel's piece was still there. Scheduled. 9 a.m. Title placeholder? The contracts that bought a government. She stared at it for a long moment. Then she opened the legal chat. A message from their lawyer, Simon. Recommend postponement. Exposure risk increasing. Mara swore under her breath. She didn't like postponing. Postponement was how stories died without anyone having to kill them. She opened her phone and called Daniel. It rang. No answer. She tried again. Still no answer. That wasn't unusual. Daniel slept irregularly. Daniel ignored calls when he was focused. But something in Mara's chest tightened anyway. She typed a message. Mara, need you. Call me. Now. She sent it and stared at the screen, waiting for the scene indicator. Nothing. A producer wandered past her desk. Morning, he said too casually. Mara nodded. You seen Daniel? She asked. The producer shook his head. He was here late, he said. Left around midnight? I think. Mara frowned. Daniel rarely left before midnight in the final stretch. She checked their shared drive. Daniel's file was there. Final. No new edit since 12:12 a.m. Mara's stomach dropped slightly. Daniel always tweaked until the last minute. It was part of him. The absence of last-minute edits felt like someone had taken his hands away. She stood abruptly. "Where's Rachel?" she asked. Someone pointed toward the conference room. Rachel was their legal liaison, young, sharp, constantly nervous. Mara found her with a stack of printed pages. "Legal is spooked," Rachel said before Mara could speak. "They got a call." Mara froze. "A call," she repeated. Rachel nodded. "From someone who represents interests," she said. "Not a threat. Just for conversation." Mara felt anger flare. "What did they say?" she asked. Rachel hesitated. "They said our source would be identified if we published today," Rachel said quietly. Mara's blood went cold. "How would they know that?" she asked. Rachel didn't answer. Mara didn't need her to. If someone knew that, it meant their perimeter had been breached. It meant someone was inside their world. She walked back to her desk and called Daniel again. No answer. Mara stared at the clock. 8:03 a.m. She had less than an hour before the scheduled publication. She didn't believe in intuition. But she believed in pattern disruption. Daniel not answering was a disruption. She grabbed her coat. A colleague looked up. "Where are you going?" he asked. Mara didn't pretend. "To his apartment," she said. The police arrived at 8:47 a.m. Not because Mara wanted them to. Because the building manager insisted. Mara had banged on Daniel's door for 5 minutes, called his name, tried his phone again and again, until her anger turned into something else. Fear, sharpened by the knowledge of what Daniel was working on. The building manager was a tired man who hated drama. He opened the door with a spare key, muttering about tenants. Mara stepped in first. The apartment smelled normal. Coffee. Paper. Soap. Nothing dramatic. The kitchen table was visible immediately. Laptop. Printed pages. Mara's eyes locked on the pages. A letter. Her throat tightened. She moved toward it instinctively, like someone drawn toward a fire. Then she froze. Because she saw the hallway. Because she saw the bedroom door partially open. Because she saw Daniel's feet. The world narrowed. Sound became distant. Mara heard someone, maybe herself, make a small, strangled noise. The building manager swore. Someone called emergency services. Then the police arrived. The officers were polite. Professional. They treated the apartment like a narrative they already understood. One officer, older, glanced at the letter on the table and nodded slightly, as if relieved. Another officer checked the door lock. Locked from inside. A simple fact that made everything easier. They asked Mara to sit. They asked her to breathe. They asked her questions in the tone people used when they had already chosen the answer. Was he under stress? Had he seemed depressed? Did he mention threats? Did he ever talk about harming himself? Mara stared at the wall and answered honestly. Yes, he was under stress. Yes, he was tired. No, he didn't mention threats. No, he never talked about harming himself. Her honesty didn't matter. Because the scene was clean. The door was locked. There was a letter. The apartment looked like a man had decided to stop. They let Mara hold the printed pages. She read the first lines and felt her chest constrict. It sounded like him. It was him. That was the worst part. The officer's voice was gentle. It appears to be suicide, he said. Mara looked up. Appears, she repeated. The officer nodded. We'll investigate thoroughly, he said. But Mara could hear the subtext. Thoroughly, within the boundaries of convenience. Mara stood abruptly, letter shaking in her hands. This doesn't make sense, she said. The officer didn't look annoyed. He looked sympathetic. People can be very good at hiding how far they've fallen, he said. Mara's voice sharpened. Daniel Mercer didn't hide, she said. He documented. He recorded. He planned. The officer nodded. Many do, he said. Mara felt anger rise. His article was ready, she said. It was supposed to publish today. The officer's eyes flicked toward his colleague. A small exchange of looks. Then the officer said, carefully. Sometimes a deadline feels like a wall. Mara stared at him. A wall. That word. It sounded like something someone had said before. Something Daniel would have mocked. Mara looked at the letter again. And then she noticed something that made her stomach twist. The printer ink was darker in some sections. As if the document had been printed in more than one sitting. As if Daniel had written it in parts. She looked at the time stamp on the printed pages, faint at the bottom. Printed at 2:52 a.m. She looked at the laptop. It was open, unlocked, as if Daniel had intended to return. No password screen. No shutdown. Daniel never left his laptop open like that. Never. Mara's breath caught. She turned to the officer. I want this treated as suspicious, she said. The officer sighed softly. Of course, he said. We will treat it seriously. But Mara could hear the resignation beneath it. Suicides were tidy. Murders were work. Mara looked down at the letter again. And then she saw the line that would echo in her mind for weeks. I can't keep waiting for permission to finish what I started. It sounded like him. But it also sounded like someone pushing him. Not with violence. With time. Mara's eyes filled, but she didn't cry. Crying would have meant accepting the story being offered to her. Instead, she did what she always did when something didn't fit. She found someone who was good at fitting things. She called Edward Hale. Edward didn't arrive until the afternoon. By then, Daniel Mercer's apartment had been photographed, measured, labeled. The death had already begun to harden into paperwork. Mara met Edward outside the building. Her face was pale, controlled. Anger held her upright. This is going to be called suicide, she said immediately. Edward nodded. I can hear that from your voice, he replied. Mara swallowed. It looks like suicide, she said. And I hate that it does. Edward didn't reassure her. Reassurance was cheap. It was what people bought when they didn't want to investigate. Instead, he asked, what feels wrong? Mara's eyes flashed. The timing, she said. It's too perfect. Edward nodded. Perfect for whom? He asked. Mara looked away. For everyone who wanted him silent, she said. Edward's gaze sharpened. And for everyone who wants this to be simple, he replied. Mara handed Edward the printed letter. He didn't read it immediately. He held it like an artifact. Paper had weight. Paper was commitment. Paper was the thing people used when they wanted permanence. Edward glanced at the bottom. The print time. 2:52 a.m. He looked up. Do you know when he last edited the article? Edward asked. Mara's voice was tight. Just after midnight, she said. Then nothing. Edward nodded slowly. A journalist stopped editing at midnight. Then wrote a letter at 2:52. That gap mattered. Gaps were where decisions lived. Edward finally read the first paragraph of the letter. Then the second. He stopped. Not because the letter wasn't compelling. Because it was. It was coherent. It was honest. It was exactly the kind of document that made police feel comfortable. Edward looked at Mara. This is not a lie, Edward said. Mara flinched. Edward continued calmly. But it might not be the whole truth, he said. Mara's breath caught. You think he was killed? She whispered. Edward didn't answer with certainty he hadn't earned. Instead he said, I think someone understood him. Mara stared. What does that mean? She asked. Edward's voice was quiet. It means if this is murder, he said, it was done with respect. Mara swallowed, angry tears finally threatening. That's disgusting, she said. Edward nodded. Yes, he replied. It is. And that's why it works. He handed the letter back. Tell me, Edward said, what time the article was supposed to publish. Mara looked at him as if the question were an insult. 9, she said. 9 a.m. Edward nodded. And when did he die? He asked. Mara's voice was hoarse. They estimate between 3 and 5, she said. Edward's gaze stayed steady. A window, he said quietly, that ensures he cannot publish, cannot intervene, cannot argue. Mara stared. Edward continued. And yet, he said, it leaves enough time for people to call it despair. Mara's face tightened. Edward looked past her, at the building. Suicide with perfect timing, he murmured. Mara whispered, so what now? Edward's eyes were calm. Now, he said, we stop asking who killed him. Mara frowned. Edward continued. We ask who needed the timing, he said. And who knew how to make Daniel choose it. Mara swallowed. Choose it, she repeated. Edward nodded. If this is what I suspect, he said, then the murder weapon wasn't rope. He paused. It was a deadline, he said. He started with the convenience. That was always the first clue in deaths that were quickly labeled simple. Simple meant no one had to stay late. Simple meant no one had to call a supervisor at home. Simple meant no one had to explain why a locked door wasn't the end of thought. Daniel Mercer's apartment was still warm when Edward stepped inside, but not from life. From occupation. From procedure. Uniforms moved carefully through the space, touching nothing with their bare hands, photographing corners the way people photographed evidence when they wanted their future selves to have no excuse for questions. A forensic tech crouched near the bedroom threshold and placed numbered markers like punctuation. A second tech held a tablet and read from a checklist. Checklist work was always calming. It made tragedy manageable. Mara stood near the kitchen, arms folded, posture rigid. She looked like someone keeping anger in place with muscle. Edward approached her quietly. She looked up as if she'd felt his proximity rather than seen him. Don't let them close it, she said immediately. Edward didn't promise. Promises were often a way to end conversation. I won't let them close it for free, he said. Mara exhaled sharply, almost a laugh, but no humor came with it. The lead officer, Inspector James Larkin, walked over. Mid-50s, a face that suggested competence without imagination, the kind of man who had solved hundreds of cases simply by not being distracted. Mr. Hale, Larkin said. We appreciate your time. This appears straightforward, but Ms. Mara, she cut in. Ms. Mara Keene requested an external behavioral perspective. Larkin continued. He said the last words politely, as if they were a courtesy, not an intrusion. Edward nodded. I'll take a look, Edward said. Larkin gestured toward the bedroom. He's in there. Edward stayed where he was. I will, Edward replied. In a moment. Larkin blinked. You don't want to. I don't want to be steered, Edward said calmly. Larkin's mouth tightened slightly. Edward kept his tone neutral. Show me the door, Edward said. Larkin hesitated, then gestured down the hall. Edward walked slowly toward the entry. The apartment was small enough that nothing could be hidden by distance. Which meant if something had been altered, it had been altered by intention. He examined the lock. No scratching, no tool marks. Locked from the inside, as reported. He looked at the hinges. No sign of removal, No fresh disturbance. He stepped back and looked at the scene between the door and the frame. A faint dark line of dust where the door met the jamb, undisturbed. If someone had forced entry, that dust would have smeared. It hadn't. Edward turned slightly and looked at the peephole. No tape. No obstruction. He walked to the nearest window. Closed. Latch intact. Outside, the street lay ordinary and indifferent. No dramatic access points. No hidden balcony. No convenient rooftop. A very convincing suicide. Edward returned toward the kitchen and stopped by the table. The letter sat under the mug as Mara had described, the paper slightly curled where the warm ceramic had pressed it down. Edward didn't pick it up. He looked at how it was positioned. Not centered. Not ceremonially placed. It was the way someone anchored a document to stop it sliding when a draft came through a window they intended to open. But the window was closed. Edward looked again at the mug. Coffee ring inside, dried. A little too old for today. Meaning the mug had been there for hours. Meaning the paper had been pinned earlier than the discovery. He glanced at the printer across the room. A modest home printer, cheap, functional. He leaned in to look at the tray. A few sheets left. Paper alignment slightly off. A jam had been cleared recently. The top sheet had a small crease at the corner, as if someone had yanked it free. Edward straightened. No one noticed a printer unless it misbehaved. Daniel had been alone, tired, printing at nearly 3 in the morning. A small domestic frustration in the middle of a fatal night. Edward glanced at Mara. Did Daniel ever print drafts? He asked. Mara's jaw tightened. No, she said. He hated paper. He said paper made people feel like they'd done something. Edward nodded. So printing is a choice, he said. Mara's eye sharpened. Yes, she replied. Which is why it matters. Larkin stepped closer, irritation now faintly visible beneath professionalism. Mr. Hale, we've documented the letter, he said. The medical examiner will. Edward held up a hand politely. Inspector, Edward said, I'm not disputing your process. I'm asking you to leave room for a second narrative. Larkin stared at him. There is one narrative, he said, voice flat. A man under pressure ends his life. That's not rare. Edward nodded. It isn't, he agreed. But timing is. Larkin's eyes narrowed. Edward continued calmly. This death occurs on the night before publication of a major investigation, Edward said. There's a printed letter. The door is locked. It is the cleanest possible ending to the most inconvenient possible story. Larkin's mouth tightened. Coincidence, he said. Edward didn't argue. He simply asked, who benefits from coincidence? Larkin didn't answer. He turned and walked back toward the bedroom. Edward watched him go. Then he turned back to Mara. Let them do what they need to do, Edward said quietly. But you and I do something else. Mara swallowed. What? She asked. Edward looked at the kitchen table again. We reconstruct the night, he said. In the order Daniel experienced it. Mara's voice was sharp. From what? She asked. He's dead. Edward's gaze stayed steady. From what he touched, he replied. From what he avoided. From what he decided not to send. Mara's breath hitched. Edward continued. Suicide isn't just an act, he said. It's a sequence. He paused. And sequences can be influenced, he added. Mara stared at him, anger and grief combining into something more useful. Then start, she said. Edward nodded. I will, he replied. But first I want to see the body. The bedroom smelled of detergent and stale air. The kind of smell you got when windows stayed closed and stress filled the space instead. Daniel Mercer hung from a beam near the closet. The rope was simple. Practical. A belt or a sheet would have been improvisation. Rope was preparation. The knot was competent, not elegant. A man who had practiced perhaps once, enough to ensure it worked. The chair beneath him lay on its side. Not shattered. Not thrown. Placed down, then tipped. Edward's eyes moved across the room. No scattered belongings. No frantic disruption. A glass of water on the bedside table, half full. No spilled drops. Meaning he had been careful. Or steady. Or both. The medical examiner stood nearby, a woman with tired eyes and a voice that suggested she disliked certainty. "We're estimating time of death between 3 and 5, she said quietly, reading Edward's interest before he asked. Edward nodded. "Anything unusual?" he asked. She hesitated. No signs of struggle. No defensive injuries. Ligature marks consistent. Edward looked at Daniel's hands. Fingers relaxed, not clenched. Nails clean. No torn skin. No abrasion. Edward looked at the floor. No dust pattern suggesting someone else had stood close for long. If someone had held him, there would be signs. There were none. It looked like a man alone. It looked like a man who had decided. Edward turned to the examiner. "Do you see many staged suicides?" he asked. She stared at him, expression unreadable. "Not many," she replied. "People who stage things usually leave mistakes because they're doing two things at once, acting and controlling." Edward nodded. "And if someone didn't stage," he asked, "but guided?" The examiner frowned. "Guided how?" she asked. Edward didn't answer with theory. He answered with something she would understand. "With context," he said. "With timing. With pressure." The examiner's eyes narrowed slightly, not dismissive, but engaged. "It's possible," she said quietly. "But it's harder to prove." Edward nodded. "I'm not here to prove," he said. "I'm here to find the leverage point." The examiner exhaled. "Good luck," she said. Edward looked once more at Daniel's face. No theatrical piece. Just stillness. He turned away. Back in the kitchen, Edward asked for Daniel's phone. Larkin handed it over reluctantly. "We haven't unlocked it yet," he said. "But it's evidence." Edward held the phone carefully, as if it could break. Not physically. Narratively. He looked at the notifications visible on the lock screen. Several emails. A message from Mara at 5:02 a.m. Another at 6:14. A missed call. A message from an unknown number at 4:21 a.m. 24 hours saves her. Edward felt a slow chill move through him. He looked up at Larkin. "Did you see this?" Edward asked. Larkin's expression didn't change. "We noted it," he replied. "Could be spam." Edward's voice stayed calm. "Spam doesn't know his deadline," Edward said. Larkin stared at him. Edward turned to Mara. "Do you know who her is?" Edward asked. Mara's face tightened. "Our source," she said quietly. Edward nodded. He looked back at the lock screen again. A second unknown message earlier, "One more night." Edward handed the phone back without trying to unlock it. The lock wasn't the point. The lock was proof Daniel hadn't wanted someone casually reading his life. Edward spoke to Larkin. "I want full extraction," Edward said. "Including deleted messages." Larkin frowned. "That requires warrants," he said. Mara stepped forward. "You'll get them," she said. Larkin's eyes flicked to her. This wasn't just a grieving editor anymore. This was a woman with lawyers and pressure. Larkin exhaled. "We'll request authorization," he said. Edward nodded. Then he looked around the apartment again. The laptop. Still open. Still awake. Edward walked to it and asked, "May I?" Larkin hesitated, then nodded sharply. Edward touched the trackpad. The screen brightened. The document with Daniel's investigation was open in the background, but not active. A blank document sat on top. Daniel's letter. Edward didn't scroll yet. He looked at the browser tabs. New sites. A government portal page. A PDF viewer. And one tab that made Edward's eyes narrow, a search query for "How long does unconsciousness take?" followed by another, "Ligature hanging time to death." Edward exhaled slowly. Preparation. But not necessarily desire. People looked up facts when they were trying to reduce uncertainty. He opened the email program. A draft was visible. Tomorrow. Subject, ready. Body, unfinished. Edward glanced at the timestamp of last interaction. 12:13 a.m. Then he looked at another draft. Blank recipient. Subject, none. A single line typed and deleted multiple times, visible in the draft history logs, "We need to delay." Edward's eyes tightened. He wasn't sure yet what it meant, but it mattered. A man who typed and deleted the same sentence repeatedly was a man fighting a decision. Edward asked softly, mostly to himself. What was he waiting for permission to do? Mara heard him and swallowed. To publish, she said. Edward shook his head slightly. Maybe, he replied. Or to stop. Mara frowned. Edward didn't explain yet. He moved to the printed letter. He finally picked it up. He read the first page. Then the second. The letter was coherent, introspective, bitter in a controlled way. Not a performance for sympathy. A document a journalist would write if he couldn't tolerate being misunderstood. It explained exhaustion, disgust with delay, hatred of permission. But Edward's attention kept returning to one thing. The letter's rhythm. It wasn't written as one long collapse. It was written in sections. Paragraphs that felt like they belonged to different moments of the night. In one section, Daniel sounded sharp, almost angry. In another, he sounded resigned. Then, later, he sounded strangely procedural, as if he'd stepped back from himself. Edward looked at the print marks again. Ink darker in places. Mara had noticed it too. Different passes, Mara whispered. Edward nodded. Which means he returned to it, he said. He didn't write it in one spiral. Mara's eye sharpened. He changed his mind, she said. Edward nodded. Yes, he replied. Or someone changed it for him. Larkin spoke from behind. You're implying tampering, he said. Edward didn't look at him. I'm implying influence, Edward replied. He set the letter down and looked at the rope in the bedroom doorway. Then at the laptop. Then at the phone. A coherent letter. A locked door. A prepared method. A deadline. An unknown number. A warning about a source. A recommendation to delay from legal. Edward's mind assembled a picture, not of murder, but of pressure. Pressure didn't need fingerprints. Pressure needed timing. By the time Edward left the apartment, the street outside looked unchanged. People walked by without knowing a man had died upstairs. A woman carried groceries. A cyclist waited at a light. A delivery truck rumbled past. Normality was always the backdrop to catastrophe. Mara walked beside Edward to his car. What now? She asked, voice tight. Edward didn't answer with a grand plan. He answered with a list. First, he said, I want the call logs and message extraction. Mara nodded. Second, Edward continued, I want the timeline of your publication process. Every time someone suggested delay. Every person who knew exactly when it would go live. Mara's eyes narrowed. You think the leak is inside, she said. Edward paused. I think the leak is wherever the timing is known, he replied. Inside doesn't always mean newsroom. Mara swallowed. Third, Edward said, I want the source. Mara flinched. No, she said immediately. Absolutely not. She's terrified. Edward's tone remained calm. I don't need her name, he said. I need her risk profile. I need to know what Daniel believed he was protecting. Mara hesitated. Then nodded once. And fourth, Edward said, voice lower, I want to know who Adrian Voss is. Mara blinked. Who? She asked. Edward looked at her. He called Daniel, Edward said. Or someone using his name did. Mara's face went pale. How do you know? She asked. Edward didn't answer immediately. Because he wasn't certain yet. But he had a feeling. A crisis manager doesn't call twice at midnight to be ignored, Edward said quietly. He calls because he knows the target will eventually pick up. Mara stared at him. You think that call did this? She whispered. Edward opened his car door. I think it moved a lever, he said. And Daniel did the rest. Mara's voice broke slightly, anger returning as protection against grief. So he was manipulated into suicide, she said. Edward met her gaze. Yes, he replied. And that's why it will be almost impossible to prosecute. Mara swallowed hard. And if you're right, she said, what do we do? Edward paused. We do what Daniel couldn't, he said. We stop letting timing be someone else's weapon. That night, Mara sent Edward everything she could. Internal emails. Legal notes. Publication calendars. A list of staff who had access to the CMS scheduling system. Edward read it all. Then he did something that would have seemed absurd to anyone expecting cinematic detective work. He created a clock. Not a metaphorical one. A literal timeline spreadsheet. From 7 p.m. to 9 a.m. And he started placing facts into it, minute by minute. Because if someone had killed Daniel Mercer without touching him, the crime would not be hidden in space. It would be hidden in time. At 11:54 p.m., Daniel stopped editing the article. At 12:17 a.m., Mara messaged him. At 12:24 a.m., the first unknown call came in, unanswered. At 12:27 a.m., the second call, answered. At 12:33 a.m., the photograph email arrived. At 2:52 a.m., the letter printed. At 4:21 a.m., the unknown number texted, 24 hours saves her. At 5:02 a.m., Mara asked Daniel for his opinion on postponement. At 5:04 a.m., Daniel replied, do what you need to do. I trust you. Somewhere between 3 and 5, Daniel died. Edward stared at the timeline. He felt the shape of it. Not a spiral. A corridor. A narrow corridor of options that had been constructed around Daniel until the only door that looked like relief was the one he took. Edward wrote one sentence at the top of his notes. This wasn't a murder that created despair. It used despair that already existed. Then he added another beneath it. And the only thing it had to control was the moment. Edward closed his laptop. He didn't sleep much. He didn't need to. In the early hours, when the world grew quiet, Edward understood something Daniel hadn't been able to accept. Publishing wasn't the only point of no return. So was dying. And someone had been careful enough to make sure Daniel reached the second before he reached the first. Edward Hale hated newsrooms. Not because they were chaotic, but because chaos there was always pretending to be urgency. Urgency justified shortcuts. Shortcuts justified mistakes. Mistakes justified silence. The newsroom smelled like coffee and electricity, overheated machines and people who hadn't slept enough to remember why they'd chosen this profession in the first place. Mara led Edward through the open floor without introducing him. She didn't need to. People recognized the posture of someone who wasn't there to contribute content. Edward noticed how conversations dipped as they passed. Not stopped, dipped. As if volume itself were something people suddenly felt responsible for. They entered a glass-walled meeting room at the far end. The irony didn't escape Edward. Transparency as performance. Mara closed the door and leaned back against it. Everyone here knows Daniel is dead, she said. Half of them think it's suicide. The other half think it's inconvenient. Edward nodded. In newsrooms, he said, those are often the same thing. Mara didn't smile. She dropped a folder on the table. Printed emails. Legal notes. Internal chats. I've pulled everything from the last 72 hours, she said. Anything mentioning delay, risk, timing, exposure. Edward sat, opened the folder, and began reading. He didn't skim. He never skimmed. Skimming assumed relevance would announce itself. It rarely did. The first email was from legal. We're comfortable with the substance, but recommend a short postponement to reassess exposure. Edward circled short postponement. He wrote in the margin, how long is short? The second email clarified. 24 hours should suffice. Edward's pen paused. He underlined 24. He looked up at Mara. Who suggested that specific window, he asked. Mara frowned. Legal, she said. But legal doesn't invent numbers. They repeat them. Edward nodded. From whom, he asked. Mara exhaled slowly. That's what I don't know, she said. And that scares me. Edward continued reading. An internal message from Simon, the paper's senior counsel. We've received informal communication suggesting escalation if published immediately. Edward tapped the page. Informal, he said. That's a lawyer's word for someone wanted plausible deniability. Mara folded her arms. He wouldn't invent that, she said. Simon's conservative, but he's not theatrical. Edward didn't doubt it. Which made it worse. He flipped the page. A message from a junior editor. Should we consider pulling the headline back until morning? Edward underlined morning. Another? We can still hold. No one will notice a day. Edward paused. No one will notice, he repeated. Mara's mouth tightened. They always say that, she said. Edward nodded. Because they assume time is neutral, he said. It isn't. He leaned back slightly. Time is leverage, he added. There was a knock at the door. Mara didn't answer it. The door opened anyway. Simon stood there, thin, precise, a man whose body language suggested he'd learned early that confidence didn't require size. He looked at Edward, then at Mara. So, Simon said, this is the behavioral expert. Edward stood. Edward Hale, he said. Simon shook his hand. Simon Feld, he replied. Legal. They Saturday. Simon clasped his hands. I assume you've read my notes, Simon said. Edward nodded. I have, he replied. I want to understand the call you mentioned. Simon stiffened slightly. I was advised not to discuss specifics, he said. Edward didn't challenge that. Instead, he asked, who advised you? Simon hesitated. Management, he said. Edward nodded. Who in management? He asked. Simon's jaw tightened. The publisher, he said. And an external consultant. Edward's eye sharpened. What kind of consultant? He asked. Simon hesitated again. Crisis management, he said finally. Mara's head snapped up. Edward didn't react outwardly. Did they give you a name? Edward asked. Simon nodded reluctantly. Yes, he said. Edward waited. Adrian Voss, Simon said. The name landed in the room like a weight. Mara inhaled sharply. Edward remained still. Describe the call, Edward said calmly. Simon swallowed. He didn't threaten, Simon said. He didn't even ask for anything explicitly. He framed it as professional courtesy. Edward nodded. What did he know? Edward asked. Simon exhaled. He knew the publication time, Simon said. He knew the article was finalized. He knew we were confident. Mara leaned forward. How? She demanded. Simon shook his head. I don't know, he said. But he did. Edward spoke quietly. And what did he suggest? He asked. Simon looked down. He suggested we consider postponement, he said. 24 hours. To mitigate risk. Edward nodded. And you agreed, he said. Simon looked up sharply. I advised caution, he said defensively. That's my job. Edward didn't argue. He asked, did you tell Daniel about the call? Simon hesitated. No, he said. I told Mara. Mara closed her eyes briefly. Edward watched Simon closely. Why not Daniel? Edward asked. Simon's voice lowered. Because Daniel wouldn't have accepted it, he said. He'd have published out of spite. Edward nodded. So you removed his agency, he said. To protect him. Simon bristled. To protect the paper, he corrected. Edward's tone remained neutral. Protection often looks like exclusion, he said. Especially to the person being protected. Simon fell silent. Edward gathered the papers and stacked them neatly. He wasn't finished. But he had enough to continue. One more thing, Edward said. Simon looked up. Did Mr. Voss mention Daniel's source? Edward asked. Simon's face drained of color. Yes, he said quietly. Edward's voice stayed even. What did he say? Edward asked. He implied she'd be exposed, Simon replied. That publication would accelerate that. Edward nodded slowly. And you believed him, Edward said. Simon didn't answer. He didn't need to. After Simon left, Mara sat heavily in her chair. So he called legal, she said. And Daniel? Edward nodded. 2 vectors, he said. 1 institutional. 1 personal. Mara's voice shook with anger. He boxed him in, she said. Edward nodded. Yes, he replied. And he did it politely. Mara slammed her hand on the table. That's murder, she said. Edward didn't contradict her. But he didn't affirm it either. It's influence, he said. And influence is harder to prosecute than violence. Mara leaned forward. So what do we do? She asked. Edward folded his hands. We keep following the clock, he said. Mara frowned. What do you mean? She asked. Edward replied calmly. Everyone who spoke to Daniel spoke about time, he said. Wait. Delay. 1 more night. 24 hours. He paused. No one argued the facts, he added. They argued the moment. Mara's eyes widened. They didn't need to disprove him, she said slowly. They just needed to stop him from acting. Edward nodded. And they succeeded, he said. Mara swallowed. By letting him believe a delay was his choice, she said. Edward met her gaze. Exactly, he said. Edward left the newsroom with a copy of every communication. He walked slowly to his car. He replayed the sequence again. Daniel had not been isolated. He had been narrowed. Options removed one by one until the only action that felt autonomous was self-destruction. Edward had seen this pattern before. In executives pushed out voluntarily. In whistleblowers who burned out. In people who decided to step away. The system never pushed. It persuaded. That night, Edward met with the source. Not face to face. That would have been reckless. Instead, he spoke to her through a secure intermediary, with layers of removal that felt almost absurd. Her voice was small. Controlled. "I never told him to stop," she said. "I begged him not to." Edward listened. "Did anyone contact you?" he asked. She hesitated. "Yes," she said. "Someone warned me." Edward's chest tightened. "When?" he asked. "Yesterday," she said. "Late." Edward's voice was steady. "What did they say?" he asked. She swallowed. "They said if the article ran today, my name would surface," she said. "That I should prepare my family." Edward closed his eyes briefly. "And if it didn't?" he asked. "They said things would quiet down," she replied. That waiting was smart. Edward nodded. He didn't ask her to name the caller. He didn't need to. "Did Daniel know?" he asked. Her voice cracked. "Yes," she whispered. "I told him." Edward felt the final piece slide into place. "Thank you," he said softly. "That's all." Edward ended the call and sat in silence. Daniel had not imagined the danger. He had been informed of it. Which meant the despair wasn't irrational. It was engineered. Edward wrote a single line in his notebook. The crime wasn't coercion. It was coordination. He added another beneath it. Everyone did their job. Edward leaned back. Chapter 1 wasn't about whether Daniel Mercer killed himself. It was about how many people helped make sure that when he did, it would look reasonable. Edward Hale believed that deadlines were one of the most misunderstood forms of pressure in modern life. People talked about deadlines as if they were limits imposed from the outside, an editor's demand, a calendar square, a reminder notification. They weren't. A deadline only became powerful when someone internalized it. Daniel Mercer had done that years ago. Edward didn't need Daniel's diary to understand how he thought. Journalists like Daniel left something better than diaries. They left habits. Edward reconstructed Daniel's working life the way an archaeologist reconstructed a culture, not by what it said, but by what it repeated. Daniel published at specific times. Not randomly. Not because of analytics, he despised analytics. Because of rhythm. Edward pulled Daniel's publication history from the archive. Years of work. Scandals. Exposés. Follow-ups that arrived just late enough to reopen wounds people thought had healed. Edward marked the times. Most stories went live in the morning. Between 8 and 10. Never late afternoon. Never at night. Daniel believed news should arrive when people were awake enough to be offended properly. Edward wrote that down. Morning publication equals moral confrontation. Edward interviewed Daniel's former colleagues. Not all at once. One at a time. People spoke differently when they didn't know who else had spoken. A former editor said, Daniel hated delays more than mistakes. Another said, he believed postponement was a kind of lying. A junior reporter recalled, he once published without legal approval because the story was already late. Edward asked the same question every time. What happened when Daniel missed a deadline? The answers were consistent. Daniel didn't rage. He didn't panic. He withdrew. He became quiet, clinical, almost detached, as if the delay had hollowed something out of him. Edward underlined that. Withdrawal is not resignation. It's internal pressure redirecting inward. Edward returned to Daniel's apartment alone, days later, after the official investigation had moved on to paperwork. The space felt different now. Not haunted. Vacant. Vacancy was worse. He sat at the kitchen table and imagined Daniel here, night after night, negotiating with himself. Edward opened Daniel's laptop again, now legally permitted. He searched Daniel's notes for the word deadline. It appeared often. Not as complaint. As obsession. Daniel wrote about the windows. Once the window closes, the story changes. After that moment, truth becomes commentary. If we wait, they control the narrative. Edward leaned back. Daniel didn't fear retaliation. He feared irrelevance. Edward whispered it aloud. Irrelevance. That was the threat Voss had exploited. Not death. Not violence. Obsolescence. Edward traced the last 6 months of Daniel's work. Each major investigation had followed the same psychological arc. 1. Discovery. 2. Verification. 3. Anticipation. 4. Delay. 5. Collapse or release. Daniel had survived the cycle many times. But this case was different. Edward saw it clearly now. This time, Daniel believed release was the only remaining way to preserve meaning. Without publication, the investigation didn't merely stall. It failed retroactively. Edward wrote. For Daniel, the story didn't exist until it was published. Delay erased reality. Edward sought out Daniel's therapist. Not for diagnosis. For language. The therapist was cautious, ethical, guarded. But she spoke in abstractions. Daniel struggled with control, she said. He externalized identity through work. He equated value with completion. Edward nodded. Did he talk about suicide? Edward asked. The therapist shook her head. No, she said. He talked about disappearing. Edward's pen paused. In what way? He asked. She hesitated. He worried that if he stopped producing, he'd vanish, she said. Not die. Just cease to matter. Edward closed his notebook slowly. That was the lever. Edward began to understand why the letter worked so well. It wasn't theatrical. It wasn't desperate. It was explanatory. Daniel hadn't written it to ask for forgiveness. He'd written it to maintain coherence. The letter preserved Daniel's identity as a rational actor. It said, this is why this happened. It makes sense. Edward wrote another line. A good suicide note doesn't express despair. It explains inevitability. Edward reconstructed the night again, this time psychologically. Daniel receives the call. Daniel receives the photograph. Daniel understands the threat is real. Daniel understands delay equals risk to his source. Daniel understands publication equals exposure. 2 bad choices. No good ones. Then legal echoes the delay. Then Mara echoes it. Not maliciously. Rationally. Everyone telling him to wait. Edward imagined Daniel sitting at the table, realizing something unbearable. That the system he trusted to publish truth had quietly aligned against the moment of truth. Not against truth itself. Against now. Edward murmured. They didn't silence him. They postponed him. Edward studied Daniel's draft history minute by minute. Between 12:13 and 2:52, Daniel touched nothing related to the article. Instead, he opened reference material. Suicide statistics. Hanging timelines. Not because he wanted to die. Because he wanted certainty. Daniel didn't act impulsively. He researched. That mattered. Edward wrote. Research before death indicates fear of failure, not desire for death. Edward visited the newsroom again. He watched how people spoke about Daniel now. Past tense. Polite. Contained. He was brilliant. He cared too much. He couldn't switch off. All true. All insufficient. Edward noticed something else. No one spoke about the article. Not really. It was already being reframed as his last work. Which meant the delay had already succeeded. Edward confronted Mara about it. They're memorializing him, he said. Mara's jaw tightened. They're burying the story, she replied. Edward nodded. Exactly, he said. Edward understood then what the real crime was. It wasn't manipulation. It wasn't even influence. It was anticipation. The killers, if that word still applied, had predicted Daniel's response. They didn't push. They waited. They understood that a man like Daniel would not survive the idea that waiting was surrender. Edward wrote the chapter's central sentence in his notebook. This wasn't murder by force. It was murder by timing a man's values against him. Edward closed the notebook. Chapter 2 wasn't about Daniel's weakness. It was about his consistency. And how consistency could be weaponized. Edward Hale had learned something early in his career that most investigators never fully accepted. People did not break when pressure was applied. They broke when pressure aligned with their values. Daniel Mercer had not been crushed by fear. He had been cornered by principle. Edward began looking beyond Daniel. Not for suspects. For mirrors. He pulled cases from his private archive, journalists, whistleblowers, analysts, people who had collapsed not under threats, but under postponement. One reporter had quit abruptly after his story was delayed pending review. Another had withdrawn a manuscript and never written again. A third had taken a leave of absence that quietly became permanent. None of them were dramatic. None of them were violent. All of them had described the same sensation. I felt like time was being taken away from me. Edward underlined it. Time theft. Not money. Not reputation. Time. Edward contacted an old colleague, a former editor who had left the industry years earlier. They spoke in a quiet cafe where the background noise made eavesdropping feel impossible. Deadlines aren't about speed, the editor said, stirring his coffee. They're about ownership. Edward raised an eyebrow. Explain, he said. When a journalist sets a deadline, the editor continued, he's claiming the story as his. Delay transfers ownership to the institution. Edward nodded slowly. So postponement feels like expropriation, he said. The editor smiled faintly. Exactly, he said. And Daniel hated losing ownership. Edward wrote it down. Delay equals loss of authorship. Edward reviewed Daniel's earlier investigations more carefully. One case, 5 years earlier, stood out. Daniel had uncovered a procurement scandal involving a regional authority. The story was solid. Documents verified. Sources protected. But publication had been delayed for 3 days. In that time, a rival outlet broke a diluted version of the story. Daniel's article still ran, later, cleaner, more detailed. But it didn't matter. The impact was gone. Edward found a private note Daniel had written afterward. We were right. And we were late. Which means we were wrong. Edward stared at the sentence. Daniel equated lateness with failure. That was the flaw. Or the strength. Depending on who was watching. Edward now saw the structure clearly. Adrian Voss hadn't invented anything. He had activated an existing fracture. Voss didn't threaten Daniel's life. He threatened Daniel's narrative. And narrative, for someone like Daniel, was survival. Edward wrote another sentence. The perfect crime doesn't introduce a new fear. It reorders existing ones. Edward returned again to the message. 24 hours saves her. It wasn't a command. It was a frame. 24 hours was short enough to feel reasonable. Long enough to be fatal. Edward asked himself the critical question. Why not ask for longer? Why not 2 days? Why not a week? Because Daniel might have adapted. Daniel might have restructured. He might have found a third option. 24 hours was a sweet spot. Just long enough to destroy momentum. Just short enough to preserve hope. Hope was the weapon. Edward realized that Daniel had died not in despair, but in suspended expectation. Waiting is psychologically unbearable for people who define themselves by action. Edward wrote. Waiting killed him. Not fear. Edward examined Daniel's sleep data, extracted from his smartwatch. Daniel had slept poorly for weeks. Short bursts. Frequent waking. But the night of his death was different. Almost no deep sleep. Frequent heart rate spikes. Daniel's body had been in fight or flight all night. Edward murmured. He didn't rest. He endured. Endurance had limits. Edward returned to the therapist's words. He talked about disappearing. Not dying. Disappearing. Edward now understood the distinction. Disappearing meant losing relevance, agency, voice. For Daniel, death was preferable to disappearance. That was the cruel logic Voss exploited. Edward didn't blame Daniel. He blamed the system that taught him that worth was measured by impact alone. Edward reconstructed the final psychological sequence again, this time without technology. 1. Daniel learns his source is at risk. 2. Daniel learns publication increases that risk. 3. Daniel learns delay neutralizes the story. 4. Daniel learns the institution agrees with delay. 5. Daniel realizes action is no longer his. At that point, Edward believed, Daniel's choice narrowed to 2 options. Times accept institutional control and become irrelevant. Times reclaim agency in the only remaining irreversible way. Edward wrote. Agency became fatal. Edward felt a familiar anger rise. Not at the people involved. At the elegance of it. This was a crime that required intelligence, restraint, and patience. It required someone who understood journalism not as a profession, but as a psychology. Edward knew then that Adrian Voss was not acting alone. Not because conspiracies were inevitable, but because understanding a man this well required proximity. Someone close to Daniel's world had explained him. Edward looked back at the timeline. The legal department. The editor. The publisher. The consultant. So many people had played small, rational roles. No single villain. Just coordination. Edward wrote. This is how systems kill without violence. They distribute responsibility until no one feels guilty. Edward closed his notebook. Chapter 2 had done its job. It had proven something crucial. Daniel Mercer's death was not an anomaly. It was a predictable outcome of a system that prized timing over truth. Which meant Edward's task was no longer to prove Daniel was manipulated. That was clear. His task now was to answer a far more dangerous question. Who understood Daniel well enough to predict his final move? Edward stood. He already knew where to look next. Not at enemies. At confidants. Edward Hale had learned to distrust the word suspect. Suspects belong to crimes of action, a blow, a shot, a visible moment where intent and consequence collided. This was not that kind of crime. This was a crime of knowledge. And knowledge was never held alone. Edward began with a simple rule. Anyone who knew exactly when Daniel Mercer intended to publish had participated, actively or passively, in the construction of that night. The question was not who wanted him dead. The question was who understood the value of that moment. He returned to the newsroom with a different posture this time. Not as an outsider. As someone mapping a system. He didn't announce interviews. He observed. Who spoke to whom? Who avoided eye contact? Who spoke too much? Edward noticed how often people used the phrase "we all knew." It was never followed by specifics. We all knew it was coming. We all knew it was sensitive. We all knew there would be consequences. Edward wrote in his notebook. We all knew is how responsibility dissolves. Edward created a list. Not of suspects. Of access. Who knew the publication date? Who knew the article was final? Who knew the source was vulnerable? Who knew Daniel would not tolerate delay? The list was shorter than expected. People loved to talk about proximity to power. They rarely noticed how few people actually had it. 1. Mara Keene, Editor-in-Chief. Mara had known everything. The date. The risk. Daniel's psychology. Which is why Edward eliminated her first. Not because she was innocent. Because her reaction pattern didn't fit. Mara had tried to protect Daniel institutionally. She had delayed because she believed delay preserved options. She hadn't understood that delay was itself lethal. Mara was guilty of misjudgment. Not orchestration. Edward noted. Those who try to save everyone rarely design perfect outcomes. 2. Simon Feld, Legal Counsel. Simon knew the date. Simon knew the pressure. Simon knew the stakes. But Simon reacted like a man confronted with danger he did not fully understand. His instinct was caution, not manipulation. He had passed information upward, not outward. Edward wrote, "Legal professionals diffuse risk. They don't shape psychology." Simon was a conduit, not an architect. 3. The publisher. Edward requested a meeting. The publisher was polite, distant, irritated by the implication that a journalist's death might reflect on the institution. He spoke in abstractions. We had to consider liability. We had to protect the organization. We couldn't rush. Edward listened. Then asked one question. Did you speak directly to Daniel Mercer that night? The publisher shook his head. No, he said. I never interfered at that level. Edward believed him. Not because he trusted him, but because men like that avoided intimacy. They delegated. Edward crossed him off. Edward stared at the remaining names. There was one category left. Not editors. Not lawyers. Not executives. Intermediaries. Adrian Voss. Crisis manager. External consultant. No formal authority. And yet, he had called Daniel directly. He had called legal. He had known the publication time. He had known about the source. Edward leaned back. Voss hadn't guessed. He had been briefed. Edward pulled Voss's professional history. Carefully. Quietly. Voss did not appear in scandals. He appeared after them. He was brought in when something needed to stop without appearing stopped. Resignations framed as personal decisions. Withdrawn lawsuits labeled mutual agreement. Delays that quietly became cancellations. Edward underlined a phrase from one profile. Voss specializes in narrative stabilization. Edward murmured it aloud. Narrative stabilization. That was it. Edward met with someone who had worked with Voss years earlier. A communication strategist who had since left the field. They spoke under conditions of mutual skepticism. He doesn't threaten, the strategist said. He reframes. He convinces people the least harmful option is also the most logical. Edward asked the key question. How does he know what to say? The strategist smiled without humor. He doesn't, she said. Not at first. He listens. Edward nodded. So someone had already explained Daniel to him, Edward said. The strategist didn't disagree. Edward returned to Daniel's inner circle. Not professionally. Personally. Friends. Former partners. Colleagues who shared late-night drinks. He asked one question repeatedly. What did Daniel fear most? The answers varied. Failure. Being late. Being ignored. But one answer repeated often enough to matter. Waiting. Edward closed his notebook. Daniel hated waiting because waiting meant surrendering authorship. Anyone who knew that could predict his breaking point. Edward traced Daniel's final days again. Who spoke to him? Who didn't? And then Edward noticed something subtle. One person who had gone silent. Not conspicuously. Conveniently. Laura Mendel. Senior investigative producer. Not a journalist. Not a lawyer. A coordinator. She scheduled. She connected. She translated between departments. Laura knew Daniel's habits. She knew when he published. She knew when he spiraled. She knew how delays affected him. And she knew Adrian Voss. Edward discovered the connection quietly. A consulting contract from years earlier. A shared panel appearance. Professional overlap. Nothing illegal. Nothing dramatic. Which made it perfect. Edward didn't confront Laura immediately. He watched. He noticed how she spoke about Daniel now. Past tense. Careful. Protective of institutional language. He was brilliant, but he pushed himself too hard. He didn't know when to stop. Edward heard the framing. Not accusation. Normalization. Edward wrote. The most dangerous people don't argue. They contextualize. Edward invited Laura for coffee. Neutral ground. No accusations. No authority. Just conversation. Laura smiled when she saw him. Professional. Curious. So, she said, you're the one asking uncomfortable questions. Edward smiled politely. Only because comfortable ones don't explain deaths, he replied. Laura didn't flinch. She sipped her coffee. What do you want to know? She asked. Edward leaned forward slightly. When did you first believe the article might be delayed? He asked. Laura answered without hesitation. 2 days before, she said. Edward nodded. And when did Daniel believe that? He asked. Laura paused. Later, she said. That night. Edward watched her face carefully. She realized it too late. Edward asked gently. Who told him? Laura didn't answer immediately. Then she said, carefully. I don't remember. Edward nodded. Memory failure under pressure. A classic sign. Edward didn't push. Instead he asked. Did you speak to Adrian Voss recently? Laura's eyes flicked downward for a fraction of a second. Yes, she said. Briefly. Edward tilted his head. About Daniel, he asked. Laura hesitated. About risk, she said. Edward nodded. And Daniel was the risk, he said quietly. Laura's jaw tightened. That's unfair, she said. Edward didn't argue. He simply said, you helped translate institutional caution into personal consequence. Laura looked at him sharply. I was trying to protect him, she said. Edward held her gaze. From what? He asked. Laura opened her mouth. Then closed it. That silence mattered. Edward left the cafe with no confession. He didn't need one. What he had was more useful. Understanding. Laura hadn't wanted Daniel dead. She had wanted the situation to stabilize. She had believed delay would calm things. She had believed Daniel would survive waiting. She had been wrong. And Adrian Voss had known she would be. Edward wrote in his notebook. The killer wasn't Voss. Voss was the instrument. The crime required someone who loved Daniel enough to misjudge him. Edward closed the notebook. Chapter 3 had done its work. The shape of the crime was now clear. Not conspiracy. Alignment. An alignment was almost impossible to prosecute. Edward Hale did not read suicide letters the way police officers did. Police read them to confirm a conclusion. Edward read them to understand a mind. Those were not the same thing. Daniel Mercer's letter had already done its work. It had convinced the first responding officers. It had calmed the medical examiner. It had allowed the investigation to shrink instead of expand. The letter did not scream. It did not accuse. It explained. Which was why it was dangerous. Edward sat alone in his office with 3 copies of the letter. One printed from the original file. One scanned from the scene. One reconstructed from metadata. He placed them side by side like a comparative anatomy. The text was identical. No tampering. No edits. No insertions. That alone ruled out a dozen theories. If the letter had been forged, it would have been sloppier. If it had been coerced, it would have been angrier. Daniel's voice was intact, which meant the letter could not be dismissed, and also could not be trusted. Edward read the letter aloud. Slowly. Sentence by sentence. Not listening for emotion. Listening for sequence. I have spent years believing that truth is enough. Edward paused. This was not a man in crisis. This was a man summarizing a thesis. It isn't a conclusion. Not despair. There are moments when waiting becomes a kind of surrender. Edward underlined waiting. Not fear. Not threats. Waiting. And surrender becomes a habit. Edward nodded. Habit implied repetition. Daniel was not reacting to a single night. He was reacting to a pattern. Edward leaned back. A suicide note usually explained pain. This letter explained erosion. That mattered. Edward examined the timestamps again. The letter had been written in segments. He could see it in the rhythm. Paragraphs changed tone. Not wildly. Subtly. Earlier sections were analytical. Later ones procedural. Final paragraphs detached. This wasn't a spiral. It was a staircase. Edward murmured. He descended deliberately. Edward compared the letter to Daniel's published work. Sentence length. Punctuation habits. Preferred transitions. The match was exact. The letter was authentic. Which meant Daniel had wanted it to be believed. Edward wrote. The letter is not a cry for help. It is a controlled narrative. Edward considered the most uncomfortable truth. Daniel had written the letter to preserve his agency. If the article did not publish, the letter would. One story or another. That was not coincidence. That was design. Edward returned to the most quoted line. I can't keep waiting for permission to finish what I started. Police read it as exhaustion. Edward read it as accusation. Not against a person. Against a system. Daniel wasn't apologizing for dying. He was explaining why waiting had become intolerable. Edward asked the only question that mattered. If Daniel had decided to die on his own, why explain? People who truly want to disappear do not document their reasoning. They erase. Daniel documented. Edward wrote. Explanation implies audience. Audience implies intent beyond self. Edward imagined Daniel's internal logic. If he delayed, he became complicit in silencing himself. If he published, he endangered his source. If he did nothing, he became irrelevant. The letter framed death as the only remaining autonomous act. Edward felt a tightness in his chest. That was not despair. That was cornering. Edward now understood the genius of the crime. The letter didn't need to lie. It needed to make sense. And it did. Which meant the investigators stopped asking questions. Edward wrote. A convincing suicide doesn't contradict truth. It completes it prematurely. Edward compared the letter's final paragraphs to Daniel's known writing under stress. There was a shift. A narrowing. Less metaphor. More instruction. Almost administrative. As if Daniel had already accepted an outcome and was simply closing files. Edward circled the transition point. This was where Daniel stopped negotiating. This was where the corridor ended. Edward whispered. This is where waiting broke him. Edward met Mara again. He slid the letter across the table. "Read it," he said. "Not as grief. As evidence." Mara read silently. Her eyes moved slower this time. She stopped at the same line Edward had. "Waiting becomes a kind of surrender." Her jaw tightened. "They trained him to think this way," she said. Edward nodded. "And then used it," he replied. Mara's voice shook. "So how do we prove it?" she asked. Edward didn't answer immediately. Because proof wasn't the right word. "You don't prove manipulation," he said. "You demonstrate inevitability." Mara frowned. "What does that mean?" she asked. Edward answered carefully. "You show that given Daniel's values, given the information he was fed, given the timing, there was only one outcome that preserved his sense of agency," he said. Mara swallowed. "You show he was led there," she said. Edward nodded. "Yes," he replied. "Without force. Without lies." Mara's eyes filled. "That's monstrous," she said. Edward didn't disagree. Edward prepared his report. Not for the police. For leverage. He reconstructed the psychological sequence and paired it with institutional actions. Not accusations. Patterns. Legal delay recommendations. Crisis management language. Source exposure warnings. Timing alignment. Each step reasonable. Together fatal. Edward titled the report, "A Predictable Death." Edward knew what would happen next. Authorities would resist. Because this kind of crime threatened systems, not individuals. But Edward also knew something else. Public opinion did not require legal certainty. It required moral clarity. And the letter provided that. Not as proof of suicide. As proof of pressure. Edward closed the file. Chapter 4 was complete. The letter had not lied. Which meant everyone else had. By omission. By politeness. By timing. Edward stood by the window of his office as night fell. Daniel Mercer had not been killed violently. He had been understood too well. Edward whispered, not in anger but in resolve. "Now we make the timing visible." Edward Hale had never liked the word murder. It suggested noise. Struggle. A visible moment where innocence and guilt could be separated by force. What happened to Daniel Mercer had none of that. Which was why it worked. Edward began the way prosecutors never did. He removed intent. Not because it wasn't there. But because intent distracted from mechanism. This was not a crime driven by hatred. It was a crime driven by optimization. Edward laid everything out on his office wall. Not photographs. Not dramatic evidence. Timelines. Messages. Institutional decisions. Human reactions. Each pinned with equal weight. Because hierarchy was part of the illusion. Step 1. Identification of risk. Daniel Mercer finishes the article. The story is airtight. Which creates a problem. Not because it's false. But because it's irreversible. At this stage, stopping publication requires intervention not against truth, but against time. Edward wrote, "Truth can survive opposition. It cannot survive postponement indefinitely." Step 2. Externalization of pressure. Enter Adrian Voss. Not as a villain. As a professional. He does not invent danger. He identifies it. He does not threaten. He informs. Voss understands one thing perfectly. Institutions move slowly. Individuals don't. So pressure must be applied asymmetrically. Edward circled this. Asymmetry is the weapon. Step 3. Parallel communication. Voss speaks to legal. Voss speaks to Daniel. Not simultaneously. Sequentially. This matters. Legal hears, delay mitigates risk. Daniel hears, delay endangers your source. Same fact. Different framing. Edward underlined it twice. This is not deception. This is selective truth. Step 4, institutional echo. Legal recommends postponement. Management agrees. Editors comply. No one conspires. No one panics. Everyone acts reasonably. Edward wrote. Reasonableness is camouflage. Step 5, psychological isolation. Daniel is not isolated physically. He is isolated cognitively. Everyone around him now agrees on one thing. Not now. Which removes Daniel's final illusion that urgency is shared. Urgency is never shared. Only consequences are. Edward wrote. When urgency disappears, agency collapses. Step 6, the false choice. Daniel is left with two options. 1. Publish and expose his source. 2. Delay and erase the story's impact. Both violate his values. Which creates a third path. Not offered. Discovered. Edward circled it. When all options violate identity, the mind creates a new one. Step 7, controlled final act. Daniel writes the letter. Not impulsively. Deliberately. The letter does not blame. Because blame would imply conflict. The letter explains. Explanation restores coherence. Coherence restores dignity. Edward wrote. Dignity is the last refuge of trapped agency. Step 8, the locked room. The door is locked. Not theatrically. Functionally. The body is discovered. The scene offers no resistance to interpretation. Edward wrote. The perfect crime leaves no mess because it needs no cleanup. Edward stepped back. There it was. No villain. No weapon. No violence. Just coordination. And timing. Edward anticipated the objections. Daniel chose this. Yes. No one forced him. Correct. There was no crime. Legally, likely. Edward wrote the final line of the reconstruction. Choice does not negate manipulation when the corridor has been engineered. Edward presented his findings privately. Not to police. Not to prosecutors. To people who understood consequence. Journalists. Editors. Public advocates. He framed it carefully. This was not a murder in the legal sense, he said. He let the discomfort settle. This was a murder in the structural sense, he continued. And structures repeat. That frightened them. Good. Edward knew the case would not go to trial. That was never the victory condition. The victory was exposure of method. Because once method is visible, it stops working. Edward received a message days later. From Adrian Voss. Short. Polite. I understand you've been asking questions. Edward replied with one sentence. I understand why Daniel died. There was no response. Edward closed the file marked Mercer. He did not feel relief. He felt clarity. Daniel Mercer had not been weak. He had been predictable. And someone had decided to use that. Edward wrote the final note of the chapter. The most dangerous crimes are committed by people who never feel like criminals. The case was over. The consequences were not. Epilogue. The article was published 47 days after Daniel Mercer died. Not under his name. Not in the place it had originally been scheduled to appear. Not with the force it would have carried if it had arrived when it was meant to. But it was published. And that, Edward Hale knew, mattered. Edward read it alone, early in the morning, before the city had decided what kind of day it would be. The headline was different. Safer. Less accusatory. It spoke of irregularities instead of corruption, of questions instead of conclusions. Daniel would have hated it. But Edward understood why it looked the way it did. Articles published after deaths always carried the weight of restraint. No editor wanted to look like they were exploiting a corpse. No institution wanted to appear defiant when grief provided such a convenient pause. The story had been edited not just by lawyers, but by time. Edward read slowly. The facts were still there. Buried slightly deeper. But intact. The documents had survived. The names had survived. And that meant something irreversible had happened anyway. Edward closed the file and leaned back in his chair. Daniel had been right about one thing. Truth alone was not enough. But it was stubborn. Mara Keene called later that morning. Her voice sounded steadier than it had in weeks. "It's live," she said. "I know," Edward replied. A pause. "They didn't kill it," Mara said. "No," Edward said. "They just aged it." Mara exhaled. "I keep wondering," she said, "if he would have wanted it this way." Edward didn't answer immediately. Because the honest answer was uncomfortable. "He wouldn't," Edward said finally. "But that doesn't mean it's worthless." Mara was silent. Then she said quietly, "They're calling it closure." Edward almost smiled. "Closure is what people call it," he said, "when they're tired of keeping something open." Edward never submitted his report to the police. He didn't need to. The case was already over in the only arena that would matter. Narrative. Instead, fragments of his findings appeared elsewhere. In op-eds. In lectures. In quiet conversations between editors who suddenly started asking different questions when a consultant suggested waiting. No one referenced Daniel Mercer directly. That would have been tasteless. But the pattern had been exposed. And patterns, once named, lost their invisibility. Adrian Voss resigned from 2 advisory boards within 6 months. No scandal. No accusation. Just personal reasons. Edward noticed the phrasing and allowed himself a brief, humorless satisfaction. Voss would continue working. Men like him always did. But something essential had been altered. People had started to ask what timing meant. And that made his work riskier. Edward visited Daniel's apartment one last time before the lease ended. It had been cleaned. Neutralized. The place where someone had died always looked smaller afterward. As if the act itself had taken up space. Edward stood by the kitchen table. The mug was gone. The printer too. Only the light remained the same. Edward imagined Daniel sitting there again, restless, calculating, exhausted. He didn't imagine regret. He imagined clarity. That was what hurt most. Daniel had not died confused. He had died understanding exactly what was happening to him. Edward whispered, to no one. "You weren't wrong." But he added something Daniel had never been able to believe. "You weren't alone." Months later, Edward was invited to speak at a journalism conference. Not as a detective. As a cautionary tale. He didn't tell Daniel's story directly. He didn't need to. He told another one instead. A hypothetical. A journalist with a finished investigation. A source at risk. An institution suggesting delay. A consultant offering reassurance. And then he asked the room one question. At what point does waiting become an act of violence? The room was quiet for a long time. That silence was his answer. Edward returned to his office that evening and found a package waiting for him. No return address. Inside was a thin folder. Documents. Updated. New. Related to a different case. Different names. Different institutions. The same pattern. Edward closed the folder and looked out the window. The city was full of stories waiting to be delayed. Edward sat down. He opened his notebook. On the first page of a new case, he wrote, "Not all murders involve killers. Some involve schedules." Then he turned the page and began again. If this story kept you listening, subscribe to the channel for more psychological detective stories, where the truth hides in details, timing, and human nature. New cases. New mysteries. The Detective Chronicles continue.